And joining us for more on all of that is Professor Brahma Chellaney, strategic analyst and professor of strategic studies at the Center for Policy Research. Thanks very much, Professor, for speaking with us. It's always hard to guess what's on the American president's mind, but what do you make of that hint, the indication that Donald Trump has given today, promising a big announcement on trade post his meeting with Prime Minister Modi? What do you think we can expect?
Trump's focus solely was on trade, with the strategic partnership with India taking a backseat. In his opening remarks to reporters before he went into talks with Prime Minister Modi, Trump only emphasized trade. It was trade, trade, and trade. It was also about business, backing major export orders from India. And in fact, he went on to say that he was expecting big trade deals with India and Japan. Now, India and Japan are close friends of the United States. So Trump's focus is not on geostrategic issues. It's about how he can extract trade concessions from New Delhi and Tokyo, how he can bag major export orders, how he can actually boost the American economy through new trade relationships with India and with Japan. So it's very clear from the opening remarks that he made that his focus solely is on trade issues.
Certainly, and the focus, meanwhile, as far as the Indian Prime Minister is concerned, also has been largely on the issue of terrorism. Stay with me, Professor. I'll just come back to you. The Prime Minister today outlined the threat of terrorism and focus on the same during the informal BRICS Summit on the sidelines of the G20 Summit, calling on the world leaders to work together to curb terrorism on a global scale. The Prime Minister defined terrorism as the biggest threat to humanity. He elaborated, and I'm quoting, "Terrorism not only targets the innocent, it creates an environment that is dangerous. We must all make it a priority to do all we can to curb and end terrorism on a global scale." The Prime Minister exchanged views with Russian President Vladimir Putin, Chinese President Xi Jinping, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa.
विश्व की अर्थव्यवस्था में मंदी और अनिश्चितता, नियमों पर आधारित बहुपक्षीय अंतर्राष्ट्रीय व्यापार व्यवस्था पर एक तरफा निर्णय और प्रतिद्वंदिता हावी हो रहे हैं। दूसरी ओर संसाधनों की कमी इस तथ्य को में झलकती है कि इमर्जिंग मार्केट इकोनॉमीज में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में निवेश के लिए अंदाजन $1.3 ट्रिलियन की कमी है।
Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale also responded to a question on the talks on terrorism that was posed to him by our correspondent Siddhant Subud.
So we saw the tweet on the bilateral between the Prime Minister and the Saudi Prince. You mentioned counter-terrorism. Can you give us the details about what kind of measures both sides are discussing? And on BRICS, you said expanding of the new development bank. Have you considered the countries? I mean, any applications have come?
No, on the new development bank, at this stage, the Board of Governors has just taken an in-principle decision to see whether we can expand the bank. The specific countries and all have not been identified, and that's a procedure. I think that the point I wish to make, and the point that is also made in the BRICS statement, is that in a short period of maybe 5 years or so, we have actually established a viable banking institution, a multilateral banking institution, and that institution has begun lending significantly and focusing on green investment. So I think what essentially BRICS has been able to demonstrate in the last 5 years is that we not only have 5 important heads of state and government to talk, but who actually act. And I think those who were skeptical of BRICS, who felt that this is an artificial creation of Goldman Sachs and there is no capacity for BRICS to grow. I think essentially that's what's been proved.
The informal BRICS summit saw Indian Prime Minister raising the issue of terrorism and protectionism. On the issue of terrorism, he strongly raised concerns on how some states are supporting the issue of terrorism, and this was reiterated by the joint statement that was issued after the summit. The BRICS Summit, the informal BRICS Summit, has become a permanent fixture at the G20 summits.
Going back across to Professor Chellaney, what's your assessment, Professor, of both the emphasis that the Indian Prime Minister has laid on the issue of counter-terrorism and the support that he's received on the same, especially at a platform like the G20, which focuses largely on economic issues?
Well, the Prime Minister focused on terrorism. President Trump focused on transactional issues. So the contrast between Trump and Modi was stark. Prime Minister Modi's emphasis on terrorism did draw support from others, but on the general principles to combat terrorism. India needs concrete support because India is in a very troubled neighborhood, a combustible neighborhood, and the epicenter of global terrorism is to India's immediate west. And unless concrete actions are taken to tame Pakistan, to force it to snap its ties with the state-nurtured terrorist complex, India's security will not be enhanced. And I think on that issue of Pakistan, the United States can play a very important role because they have the leverage over Pakistan. When Secretary of State Pompeo was in New Delhi, he branded Iran as the world's biggest state sponsor of terrorism. But when it came to Pakistan, he was not willing to talk about concrete action against Pakistan. The Americans have leverage over Pakistan. They can exert that leverage over Pakistan. They even have a multi-million-dollar reward on the head of Hafiz Saeed, but they're not doing anything even to get Hafiz Saeed captured or arrested by the Pakistani state. I think on those concrete issues, India would very much like American cooperation in action, rather than American words about building cooperation with India to combat terrorism.
Indeed, and I think that summarizes for us also for our viewers on what the key focus areas have been over the last few hours at the G20 Summit. We're going to leave it there for the moment, Professor. Appreciate very much for joining us with all of those perspectives.